Why there are two creation stories in the Bible. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 have two different accounts of how everything began when you comparing them side by side. But here is why. The two stories don't match up. Anyone who reads Genesis 1 and 2 can clearly see that these are two different stories. However, I don't call them stories. I call them two different makers. The God in Genesis 1 is a master maker. He is Elohim. And the God in Genesis 2 is a junior God, Yahweh. At that time, Yahweh was a local God, not a universal God. He seems he could learn a thing or two from the master God, Elohim. Elohim made the universe in Genesis 1. So you may think this is just one seamless narrative, or the writers of Genesis made crucial mistake when documenting the event in creation as they document Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. But let us take a closer look at Genesis 1. It is well structured, a well-written paragraph showing a master maker, God, Elohim, making the universe in precision. Day by day, creation happened like clockwork. He made the universe in an orderly fashion. This is exactly how he did it. Light comes first, because without light, the writers of Genesis 1 couldn't put a timestamp on the order of how the creation of the heavens and earth came about. One need light to start time. Simply put, you cannot have time without light. So for God to make something on the first day, that thing is got to be light to create the timestamp of the beginning in the sequence that the event making the heavens and earth. For example, land, water, plants, and animals. But on day 6, human, male and female, all created at the same time. If you notice in Genesis 1, Elohim did not use physical strength to create the heavens and the earth. He just said, let there be light, and there was light. Let there be water, separate them from water, and so it be. And God said, and it was good. Then he said, let there be day and night. And day separated from night. And he said, it's good. There was no physical work needed to be done for Elohim to create the heavens and the earth. And at the end, when he created man, he said it was good. But in Genesis 2, boom, the earth was barren. No plants, no trees, no water, no birds, no fish. So Yahweh got to get down without a workable plan and start making man, Adam, from the tough dirt. He formed Adam from the dust of the earth and breathed life into him. So this is Yahweh, a junior God, not the deity who is the maker of everything in the universe, But Yahweh is a junior God who is a maker of some things on the earth, not all things. And his way of making things is not as making things without a sweat as Elohim did. Yahweh has to get down in the earth and get dirty to make Adam out of dirt, working up a sweat, dip his hands in the dirt to make Adam and blow breath in him. And he could only make one human per time. Wow, Elohim made man and woman, and she and he at the same time, on the same day. Elohim, human that he made, didn't even need food to eat, because he didn't even have to plant a garden, because he made everything that the man and the woman is going to eat all before he made man and woman. But in Genesis 2, Yahweh made man, then plant a garden, including planting fruit trees in the garden. Wait until it bear fruit for the man. Then the man eat the fruit. Then he found out that eating alone is not the best thing to do in the new world. So he tell God that the animals are not good company keepers, so he is lonely. So God make him a companion woman named Eve around 20 or 30 years after he made Adam. But why are the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 stories are so different? The God Elohim in Genesis 1 has master power and precision, creativity, skills, and he can create from a distance. When Yahweh in Genesis 2 is a God who creates with his hand, and his creation involves physical labor, with him getting down and dirty. Here is what is strange in Genesis 2. Adam was created. Then Eve came after. The God in Genesis 2 planted a garden and put the man, Adam, in it. He didn't make trees with fruits. He planted it and wait till it bear fruits. Then he put the man in it to help. Let's play the devil's advocate. Let's say he planted an orange tree. That's almost 3 years for an orange tree to bear oranges. But the God in Genesis 1 did not plant trees. He talked the fruit trees into existence with fruit all ready to eat on them. And Eve and Adam didn't have to wonder where their meal is going to come from. But in Genesis 2, Yahweh planted the fruit trees, and Adam got to be waiting around until the fruit trees bear fruit for him to eat. And Eve did not came about in Genesis 2 until the garden was totally ready. Let's say that takes at least 10 to 20 years to plant every fruit or most fruit that a human will need to survive on a diet with just fruits, not a diet. At that time, they weren't on a diet that they eat meat. It was only fruit. So imagine the different fruits that needed to be planted in that garden. So Eve didn't made her appearance maybe until 10 to 20 years after Adam was created. No wonder why Adam was lonely. Scholars and historians are puzzled by these two events that are presented side by side in the Bible that are said to be the same but are two different stories. They are night and day apart from being the same story. But guess what? They followed each other in Genesis, but are presented as the same event. It is that the Bible is not flawless, or it is two events from two different times. Do you know that Elohim is a plural noun? But although it is a plural noun, it takes a singular verb. Elohim is the God in Genesis 1, while Yahweh is the solar God in Genesis 2. In other words, Elohim is a high God that is very busy making universe, and is so divine in nature that he is not personable, accessible as the God Yahweh in Genesis 2. Elohim makes stuff boom, and they came about instantaneously, and then he's on his way doing other stuff in different universe. While the God in Genesis 2 is very personable, a God who make Adam and stick around him for about 20 years or so. The God in Genesis 2 was just take it as it comes. He made Adam. He was a single parent. Didn't have shelter or a home for Adam. So he planted a garden so that Adam could have food to eat. But the God in Genesis 1 made everything for Adam and Eve, or the man and the woman. It was like a buffer line for the man and the woman in Genesis 1. But the Adam in Genesis 2 was on some sort of ration because he had some restriction on him, because he couldn't eat from two trees in the garden that Yahweh planted. So in Genesis 1, there was no reason for man to sin or disobey Elohim, because everything was so structured in Elohim creation that the man was catered for. They had all that they needed. The man and the woman, they were in an all-inclusive garden. Everything was there before they get there. However, in the Genesis 2 version, the man comes first, then his food, his water, his shelter, his pets, and last, his woman that came some 20 to 30 years after he was made. So he was going through a hard time, or he had a little hiccups along the way. It may be because Yahweh is a personal God and was involved in Adam's life more like a father figure rather than God, his creator. But the Genesis 1 is reflecting the authors who were given the account of the event from their perspective as priests. So God is very structured to them, while Genesis 2 was written by wise men who were storytellers, who write Genesis 2 and reflect in a more personal experience rather than a divine nature, as in Genesis 1. So that's why you see Yahweh hang around Adam for about 30 to 50 years in the Garden of Eden to have a interpersonal relationship with Adam and Eve and their first two children, Adam and Eve. The difference in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Maybe the authors of Genesis 1 are writing the Bible when the gods were more like a Babylon god that were polytheistic in nature, so they were not easily accessible, especially the high God. But the writers of Genesis 2 are writing the event or the story of Genesis in a monotheistic time. So they wrote the story to represent a sociable God who would have time to spend with Adam and Eve. Moreover, since they were the only ones on earth, so God Yahweh did not have the time to be around them all the time. Furthermore, these two stories may have written centuries apart and reflect the thinking of that time, that these two stories were written of the same event but with different worldview or perception of God in that era, and reflect the social and religious worldview of the time that they were written. Let's look at Adam and Eve and how they pull up. In Genesis 1, there was no Adam and Eve. We only assume that the first human were Adam and Eve, because it is when we read Genesis 2 that we are of the opinion that the characters in Genesis 1 were indeed Adam and Eve. Why is this so? Because in Genesis 1, the story says, on the sixth day God created man and woman, he and they. The story never gave them a name. That's Genesis 1 was talking about Adam and Eve. It was talking about a man and a woman. The story, or Elohim, never give a name to the beings he created. Moreover, we know that they are different from Adam and Eve, because in Genesis 2, Adam was created first, and Eve created some years after, and those years could be 20, 30, or 40 years. Moreover, she was created from Adam's rib, made them join to the hip, so she is a part of him, and some part of him is her, making him weaker in some respect and making her weaker than him, because only one of his rib made her. In Genesis 2, Adam was the only one, but he was no good by himself. He had the world but no happiness. So in Genesis 1, the man and the woman were equally yoked, but in Genesis 2, the man was lonely and not happy. Even when he has God around him, he couldn't get it together and be happy. So in Genesis 1, God made man and woman. He made them equally. None of the man was taken out to make the woman. So they were equal in nature, equal in spirit, equal in thought, equal in appearance. Only thing differs was the gender. But in Genesis 2, the man was on earth some 50 to 60 years before the woman joined the man, because Yahweh had to make preparation for the man. So the man was suffering while Yahweh was making the garden, making his food and his shelter. And then came, boom, the woman. So Yahweh had to take a rib from him and make a woman. So that's how man and woman came to depend on each other, because they are connected to each other. Flesh of his flesh and bone of his and her bone. So in Genesis 2 doesn't show a hierarchy of patriarchy. What it shows is interdependency of man and woman. They are dependent on each other, because in the garden the man was lonely without his partner, companion, the woman. And if it was vice versa, and the woman was made first, she would be lonely without her partner, the man. So it is an interdependency Genesis 2 showed between Adam and Eve. Genesis 2 doesn't show that women were created for man. If woman was created for man, the woman would have created first. In Genesis 2, what Genesis 2 is saying is that man was created for woman, because even when he was first, he was lost. Even when he was with God, he complained that he is lonely. Even if that was the worldview at that time, that woman was made for man, it seems that with a woman, Adam would be a train wreck. But why these two stories were kept in the same place in the biblical story? Is it that it is showing the patriarchy or matriarchy? So Genesis 1 may have shown the patriarchy when Elohim says he created man and woman, and just by calling man first, that may show that man is first, is the patriarchy. And that is how the priest may write Genesis 1 to depict their worldview of that time. But the writers in Genesis 2 may balance out things and not showing a patriarchy, because even while Adam was made first, Eve couldn't get it together or compose himself. So Yahweh hooked up Adam with a woman. So now the woman may be the head of the man and make the matriarchy superior over the patriarchy, as the writers depicts in Genesis 2. Why Genesis 2 is totally different from the well-structured creation of the universe in Genesis 1. It is clearly that you can see that in the timestamp of Genesis 1, Elohim created heaven, earth, plants, animals, and grand finale on day 6, human, man and woman. It is orderly and make human not wanting for anything in Genesis 1. There is no reason why the man and woman in Genesis 1 have any reason to sin, because their society was well structured in the sequence that things were created by Elohim in Genesis 1 creation. But if you look at the structured things were created in Genesis 2, then you will see the structure was of the creation needs more to be desired, or it was deliberate. Moreover, Adam was the first creation, even before he had a garden with plants or tree to give him food. Compared to Genesis 1, everything was provided for the man and woman, comfort. They did not need of anything once they were created. It was as if they were at the Babylonian. In Genesis 2, Adam was made first, then Adam was like a baby. He was hungry, a single parent. Yahweh plant a garden, orange trees and other fruits, and those garden or those fruit trees take an average of at least 5 to 10 years to be fully bearing fruits to feed Adam and his prospective wife, Eve. So things weren't as smooth as the God in Genesis 1, who prepared everything at the same time, or everything he prepared before he made the man and the woman. So the man and the woman have everything conveniently for them once they were alive. But in the creation story in Genesis 2, Yahweh created the man, and the man was lonely. He created animals to keep Adam company according to the writers of Genesis 2. Then that didn't go so well, so he created Eve. But to Yahweh credit, he was a junior god or a local god to the writers of Genesis 2, so he wasn't the well-structured god like Elohim, his father. At that time, Elohim had the perfect execution plan, while Yahweh seems like a knee-jerking plan, not at his best in Genesis 2. But Genesis 2 may seem like a mess, but its writers didn't want to tell the story as the writers did in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 was the story of the universe and how God, Elohim, can make nothing into something with the man and woman as the footnote. However, in Genesis 2, everything is all about the man and the woman and the garden and how God stick to his one man and woman story. That was the narrative of Genesis 2. No matter how it looked like a mess, but the narrative is how God stick to the man and the woman in the garden. Genesis 1 was the Big Bang. Boom, shining stars and universes. But in Genesis 2, the bright light is shown on the man and the woman, that where it starts and everything else revolves around Adam and Eve. So they become creation, and without them there would be no need for creation, according to the writers of Genesis 2. Moreover, Genesis 2 is saying that the man was put in the garden to take care of it. However, the garden is representing the planet, and he and her was put on the planet to take care of it. And the man and woman belongs to each other, because if they did not belong to each other, why did God only make one pair, so that he doesn't have to keep making man over and over again? Was the storyteller's idea of Genesis 2. So that's why humans were made to be the main point of the story. The who, what, when, where, and why. Genesis 1 is telling you that without creation you couldn't have man. And Genesis 2 is telling you without man and woman, creation won't last. So these two creation stories are sitting next to each other in the biblical text, but they don't see eye to eye. But they differ from each other, but are in the same creation context. But if you look at the Sumerian text, you could see why Genesis 1 is written in the way it is written. In the Sumerian text, the high god Marduk slaying Tiamat, and used her body to form the heaven and the earth. He used half of her body to make the heaven and the earth. This was before creation. This was before no gods whatsoever had been brought into being. The only entities was Apsu and Tiamat. There were no other things or gods. So Apsu and Tiamat mixed together and formed gods. Merdu created night and day, the constellation, moon, clouds, rain, and their waters created the Tigris and Euphrates. And then he created man to serve the gods. That would be their Genesis 1. The similarity with Genesis 1 in the Bible, they make heaven and earth, then made man. But they had multiple gods. But the Bible, Genesis 1, it was Elohim who made the heaven and the earth. Their Genesis 2 is Enki and Kina, who were the chief gods who made Adam and Eve. They called them Adam and Eve. They made them out of clay, and the sacrifice of one of the lesser god from the Ijiji. But the Adam and Eve was to serve the gods, the Mesopotamia and the Babylon gods, for the burden of labor. But the Sumerian gods were way before the gods of the Bible, and they also called the place that they kicked out Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden as well. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 of the Sumerian text sounds eerie, similar to the biblical creation text. But it is said that the ancient Sumerian text was way before the biblical text. In the Sumerian text, how Adamu and Eva was kicked out of the Garden of Eden was not because they sinned, or was not because they eat from the tree of knowledge. However, they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden because one of the gods, while making Adam and Eve, gave them knowledge in their gene or in their DNA. They take the knowledge from the gods and mix with human DNA, and that's how they get knowledge. But the chief god did not know that the Adam and Eve get knowledge. So one afternoon, the chief god was walking in the garden in the shade of the sun, and then he saw Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve put fig around them and hide. And then the god saw that they were hiding, and the god knew that Adam and Eve knew that they were naked. So he went back to the God who created them and asked, "What the hell have you done?" And then the God said, "We gave them some knowledge, but we didn't give them eternal life. They're gonna die." So the chief God ordered them out of the Garden of Eden, because the chief God didn't want Adam and Eve to get knowledge or eternal life, that they live forever. So you see how these two, the Sumerian creation story and the biblical creation story, are eerie similar. But the Sumerian story of creation outdated the biblical text by thousands of years. according to scholars and historians. So the biblical text may be telling bits and pieces of the Sumerian, ancient, Anunnaki tablets, text in Genesis 1 and 2, and put a spin on it, since the Sumerian text predate the Bible. But the writers of the biblical text, especially Moses, who wrote those 5 first books of the Bible, he was Sumerian. So he may have known about those texts and take bits and pieces to write those stories of creation in the biblical version.